Sunday morning. This is Bob Brown. That was my
Oh,
camera.
there you go.
I want to show them the wall instead.
We have great production values here at B Cube Sunday morning.
Hey, we do have great production values because our production values center on the guests that we bring. And we've got wonderful guests this morning. And I can say that two of you have or are ready to be in a BQ anthology. Brenda, someday when she's really lucky, she'll get that honor. Uh, or when we're really lucky.
I think when B Cubed is really lucky.
Yeah, I think
it would be. I think it would be a mutually beneficial event because BQ. You will find Brenda is one of our co-hosts on the first Sunday of the month, where we do Sunday brunch with her and Karen Anderson and Irene Radford. But I am going to turn this over very shortly to our good friend Cliff Winnig because he's going to talk about something that is near and dear to our hearts, or a tragedy that is the basis of humanity. That's what you're going to have to do, Cliff, because it's going away. This is BQ Press's first effort into war. We made it part of the alternative series, and I will tell you, we have got. I'm not going to eat up the hour by blathering on about it, but I will tell you this: it was one of our best sellers, and it was a wonderful book. Has the cover art is by Jim Wright, and so urge you to get it. And as we go through, you're going to see other pieces pop up on the screen. And that $1.25 price was, I think, the Kindle. So, Cliff, tell us about your show today, and I'm going to say goodbye.
Bye, Bob. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Good morning, everyone. My guests and I are going to be discussing the topic of war in science fiction, hence the Alternative Wars book. This is not going to be, because it's such a big subject, we're not going to talk about military SF. So think more War of the Worlds than Starship Troopers, and that should orient you. Our three guests today, a couple of returning guests, Andrew Roberts, whose story-length poem, Nair Day, is in Alternative Holidays from BQ Press, and that is about a soldier who comes home after wars in space and time dilation to his sister, his kid sister, who's now much older than he is. And he's also written other war-related stuff, but we will talk a little more about the science fiction side than the more fantasy mainstream side. Brenda Clough and Martin Shoemaker are both in this book that just came out from Baen, Weird World War China. And in addition, Martin has recently published Ula, a musical take on H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, which I think probably owes as much to Jeff Wayne as H.G. Wells.
I have to correct. There's nothing musical about the book, and I have never seen Wayne's production.
Okay. Well, I will say, I mean, it's about entertainment and Martians.
Yeah.
And,
I
mean, it's about musical. It's not a musical.
It's not a musical.
It's about music in a way. But definitely, playing off, it's a take on War of the World, because there've been a lot of sequels written on about War of the Worlds. And this is one of the coolest ones I've ever seen, because it's a very different take. But I've never seen Jeff Wayne's musical version either. He only tours like Europe and the UK. and he's never come to the States, but it is one of my favorite albums. So here we are, and these are all fabulous writers who have written about the subject of war. So, as we all know, war is just about the worst thing humans have ever invented. I mean, okay, there's pineapple pizza, but some people really like pineapple pizza. And
Chuck E. Cheese. Chuck E. Cheese is the worst thing people have invented. The human race. Shame.
Shame. But also
go with
war, really bad. Like, you know, bad things happen to good people. Good people do bad things. You know, it is a just horrific amount of what they, you know, lovingly call collateral damage that happens in any war. And we're seeing a lot of wars, small wars now. And so it's sort of weighing on people. But science fiction is uniquely positioned to talk about war in the future and alternate histories, like what could have happened. And so one of the things that it's good at is, you know, like, okay, if this keeps up, how much worse could it get? Or could this like alleviate some of the horrors of war? There was that famous Star Trek episode where there were two planets having a nuclear war, only they weren't having a nuclear war. They were having a pretend nuclear war with disintegration boots. And Kirk basically kicked over the punch bowl on that episode and ended that war. And, you know, that came out in the height of the Cold War and was a reaction to the threat of nuclear violence. So, but it also sort of pointed out where things could get worse in a way. So would any of my guests like to jump in and talk about not really the predictive power of science fiction, because we all know that science fiction doesn't predict the future in the way of a crystal ball, but the idea of science fiction being able to talk about aspects of war that haven't happened yet or that could happen?
You know that one of the things that war does do for us is it supplies evolutionary pressure on technology. A large number of the things you're looking at, including this screen that you are doubtless looking at this exact second, were driven by the, eventually, if you track all the money back, it was all DoD investment. We were worried about, you know, battle communications, things like the entire space program. One of the things that we've learned to do is sort of displace, rather than shooting people, we could shoot things into the sky and sort of be very phallic about the whole thing. And that helps, in a sense. That's better than, you know, carnage and blood and radioactive waste. It's better to have a competition to get to the moon. And it's the same principle with the Olympics, you know, that we could just get this off of the battlefield onto the racetrack or something. But when you look at the amount of stuff that has been generated by, we've done a lot of pretty good shit, I guess is what I'm saying, because one of the things that's done, it's ground the economy around. And if people can make a ton of money manufacturing cell phones, then suddenly they're not poor anymore and they have a whole lot less incentive to go to war. I guess the great example of this today is China. In our lifetime, it has, you know, I forget how many gajillion people have been lifted out of abject poverty into minimalist poverty. You're no longer starving. It's just that you no longer have an Apple cell phone. Oh, come on up if you want to. I'm sorry, my cat demands attention here.
Yeah, but I would also point out how many beneficial things have not been invented or created because all the money's been funneled towards war.
That's true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It certainly altered the path of technology, right? It advanced certain industries and didn't advance others. There was, I remember there was a scene in one of Michael Moorcock's Coram novels where he goes to some world where, because of war, they had got really advanced technology in artificial limbs. Mm-hmm. Right? And that was all because people were getting their arms and legs hacked off or blown off or whatever. And so I think it was a Coram book, because I think he may have picked up one of those limbs there. But but war. Yeah, I mean, it's on one hand, Andrew. Yeah, it's a terrible waste of resources, isn't it? I mean, you put all this money into, like, how much does a single Tomahawk missile cost, right?
Maybe as much as your house, you know.
Yeah, like how many people could you feed off that, right? I mean, as a species, if you look at humanity as a species, as a system, and you think, is war a really good use of our resources? Right? The answer is no.
Competition really makes a difference. It's not really efficient for deer to have bigger and bigger antlers, but I'm competing with other male deer. I have to have these antlers, and gradually you really get some serious antler going, so it's both good and bad. Their evolutionary forces are driving us in a certain direction. And I don't know how we can get off the train, but there's something to be said for completely switching it over to shot put and pole vaulting rather than guns.
Sure. So, like, sports is a sublimation of war, right? Like the purpose of the Olympics in ancient Greece was really interesting. I toured the city of Olympus that had the Olympic Village and all of that, and our guide went into some detail, and he pointed out some things that are kind of obvious in hindsight, but we don't necessarily think about, which is that every 4 years they had the Olympics, which meant that 1 out of every 4 years during the weather favoring war season, because you don't wage war in the middle of winter or whatever, or harvest, then they were doing Olympics rather than fighting. But more importantly, because they were these small city states, the Olympic athletes weren't professional athletes, they were soldiers who happened to be the most physically fit of the soldiers, and they would compete, but they would all have to live in the Olympic Village with all of their competitors from the different cities. And the hope was that after they retired from military service, they were often the leaders of these cities. Well, when the cities were facing tension 10, 20 years in the future, when these guys were statesmen, they could remember their neighbor in the Olympic Village whom they were friends with, and maybe talk to them instead of, going to war. So that was a system of sublimating war that was, I guess, somewhat effective, not entirely. Okay, a couple of comments. A Tomahawk missile is about $2 million. So that's
it's more than your house, probably. Although if you live in California, maybe that's just what your house costs.
Yeah. But, on the other hand, given what the Houthis are doing off the coast of Yemen, it's actually good we have a military and we can strike back, right? Because
it is important for our survival, because you can see, you have to have a military. You have to. It's a rough world out there, and there's something to be said for being on the top of the food chain.
Sure.
And as sublimation goes, ask any psychiatrist. Sublimation doesn't solve the problem. It might let you ignore it for a while, but those Greek states still went to war.
They did.
But every problem pushed off, to tomorrow is a problem that is not killing you today. And when you look at it over the very long haul, actually, Greece is in reasonably good shape. They no longer are fighting city states. They've dragged it to the national level, but it is still, it is definitely better in Athens now than it was then.
Although you still have groups like Golden Dawn.
Maybe
sublimation Martin's not an answer.
No, but it's a Band-Aid that sometimes helps.
Sure, a Band-Aid can staunch bleeding, but it can't, fix a sucking chest wound. So it depends on how bad it is.
We recently saw videos on the Christmas truces during World War I. Beautiful, beautiful. Some conversation before the show started about how these were all the same dynasty fighting in Europe. They were essentially family lines fighting each other. So they had a lot in common. And taking the day off for Christmas was just a beautiful thing. And then the next day they were killing each other again.
Yeah, but most of the officers that were involved in that were court-martialed.
Yep.
The Christmas truce is it may look good in a Paul McCartney movie or a Paul McCartney video or something.
It looked great in the Paul McCartney video.
The worst part of it is, and no one wants to say it, is you socialized with your enemy that you were going to shoot the next day, and they did.
And it's more psychologically damaging that way.
Yeah, the Christmas truce is. I mean, one of my favorite movies is called Joyous Noel, and it's a great movie, but the reality is, it's fraternization with your enemy that you're going to have to kill. World War One is a real defining war that gets overlooked because that was when all the big mythology of glory and honor and individual heroism was reduced to industry.
It's when they switched over from really cool uniforms with hats with feathers on top to
the officers still had those. But
but not the poor blighters.
No, you did not want to be visible on the battlefield anymore.
Yeah. But I'm sorry if I sound like Mr. Debbie Downer here,
No. I mean, let's face it, war, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing, except cool science fiction stories.
My children are in the U.S. Army, and my daughter went to Afghanistan. And so you're never going to persuade me that it is a really good idea to do that. I just had to spend that whole year in denial. I pretended she was in Arkansas, and that was okay because it was too scary to contemplate. But it is a powerful, one of the reasons we keep on having war is that it's a powerful developer of society and the individual level of human beings. She came back a much more frightening person from Afghanistan than she did from college. And it turns out that, kicking ass in Afghanistan really does something for you.
Yeah.
My brother's still dealing with post-traumatic stress from Vietnam. So.
Yeah.
So Liam Westcott pointed out the wonderful Peter Jackson documentary, They Shall Not Grow Old, which Andrew and I went to the theater together to see. But it is available on like Blu-ray and stuff, and it's very much worth watching. Martin, since you haven't been talking as much as I want you to be talking, I'm going to ask you a specific question, which is Brenda alluded to, I think it was Brenda alluded to, like sometimes the disparity between sides in war. And of course, in H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, there's a huge technology disparity between the British Empire and the Martians. And in your book, you, of course, wrote a whole novel based on the War of the Worlds, but also kind of undermined some of the themes. Could you talk about your decisions and what you did with that?
Basically, I read Wells's book again for the first time in probably 40 years. Yes, I'm old. And I started seeing, first of all, with some research in the background, that he was, let's say, misleading. He wasn't lying. He was misleading. The narrator saw 10 capsules leave Mars, and 7 of them landed in London. This isn't a war of worlds. It's a war of neighborhoods. And he said in interviews that his whole point in the story was he wanted to tell a story of his neighborhood getting blown up and all of his neighbors being characters in the book. So I said, I'll do that too. And then I started reading his book and started seeing that there were plenty of hints that the whole thing could be a horrid misunderstanding that nobody controlled. And if that isn't a common thing in war, I don't know what is. Fog of war is really, really the cause of a lot of entanglements that we never intended. And everything in there is based on stuff that was in his novel, interpreted from another point of view, and what would be the consequence from there. I did not have to invent a thing. I used his own writing just to say, what if somebody outside was looking at this? How would they see it? And that's kind of how I approach war stories, because I'm not military. I can't write good military action, but I can write how it affects the world and the civilization and the civilians.
Which is exactly the topic of this podcast, which is why I asked you on. And I'm so glad you're all three able to make this, because this is a great ensemble. All right. So yeah, that's a wonderful segue into another thing science fiction does very well, which is the miscommunication across species lines in cultures, right? So, there's cultural anthropology where you can have definite miscommunications, but you can amp that to 11 with science fiction with different species. There's the whole, in Babylon 5, there's the Earth-Minbari War that was started by a misunderstanding about what opening gun ports on a ship meant, that the Minbari did, and combined with a loose cannon on the human side. And in Ender's Game, of course, you find out that the buggers had misunderstood the nature of humanity, and the humans had misunderstood the nature of them, that had led to what wound up being a genocidal war. And that's kind of a military SF novel, but it's also got that element of tragic miscommunication. So I'm wondering if anyone would like to talk about like the total, the fog of war aspect and the cultural differences that can lead to either war or not war, depending on, a coin toss, really.
Charles Smar just put a comment in the comments section about Enemy Mine and the Forever War. And I think Enemy Mine and the extended sequel, The Enemy Papers, may be one of the best books on this ever.
Barry B. Longyear.
Yep. If you've only read Enemy Mine, which is awesome, you should go read The Enemy Papers, which just about tore my heart out and stomped on it at the end.
That's awesome. I didn't know that existed, so I've only read the first one.
Yeah, the Enemy Papers is what happens when you try to make peace, and there are elements on both sides who will die before they will let you make peace. And the ending just, I can only read it every few years because it tears me up every time.
I'll definitely hunt that down. Thank you. Also, Star Trek 6 was about that, right? The Undiscovered Country was about people on both sides. Oh yeah, Enemy Mine was based. Cheryl asked, yes, Enemy Mine was based on a story by Barry B. Longyear.
A classic story.
Yeah, and it was made into a good movie. He got lucky.
Don't tell Barry that.
Well,
Barry hates the movie.
That's okay.
It is okay because this, movies are such a important thing for our culture. The movie is almost certainly better known than the story or the book.
Oh yeah,
and it can be a gateway drug to the book, so
exactly.
people can find it through the movie.
Yeah, if 1 million people watch a movie in today's blockbuster era, it's a flop. If 1 million people read a book, it is a New York Times bestseller for the year.
Yeah.
Much as I love books, much as we love books, we are a tiny chunk of the public.
Absolutely. They have a lot of movies have so much power, but that is all right, because if that was even a reasonable movie, then a lot of people, it'll be essentially immortal. The story will be immortal.
Yep.
And right, it sells a lot of books. L. Ron Hubbard, Battlefield Earth, which is pretty much universally acknowledged as a horrible book. It more than doubled their sales of the book when that movie came out. That horrible, awful movie was a
John Travolta.
Yeah. I foolishly went and saw that in the theater without reading reviews first.
Oh that must have been nasty.
Speaking of books versus movies,
yes,
in the Civil War, especially among the Confederacy, copies of Les Miserables were passed around from soldier to soldier throughout the war. I don't think people are passing around DVDs of the musical.
Yeah. But they did circulate the tapes for MST3K, right? They put that at the end of every episode. Keep circulating the tapes because people were passing VHSs around. of MST3K. So, yeah. So let's see if there's any audience things that I can pull in real quick, because we got a lot of great stuff said in the chat, but we've been chatting away ourselves. Liam Westcott points out, as it's been said before, science fiction does not predict the future. Science fiction imagines the future, which is a really great distinction. I like that. Thank you.
Yeah, by reflecting upon the present.
Mhm.
And I forget who said it, but it also scouts the future, lets us think about what we would do.
Thank you, Bob, for putting the enemy papers up there. Awesome.
It is so much cheaper to imagine a society on the page and say, I don't want to be like, the Morlocks and the Eloi in The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. We don't want a society like that. And it's cheaper to write it and think about it and decide not to go there than it is to actually do it and discover it was a flop.
Yeah, I think actually one of the great war books that isn't normally thought of as a war book is 1984. Right? Because the war is constant.
It's perpetual, yeah.
And it's in the background. And there's that scene, to me, one of the most character defining scenes, which is horrifying in the book, is where Winston Smith is walking down the street and he's past the rubble of a destroyed building and there's a hand that's been blown off and he just kicks it out of the way.
Isn't the line in the book that war is waged by its own government against its people?
Yeah.
So
right.
It is, and the line, we've always been at war, and the idea that it has been a perpetual state by decree of the government.
Yeah. So, and then there's like, there's always propaganda. War and propaganda are always, very, very closely connected. Like the song Johnny, I Hardly Knew Ya was changed into Johnny Comes Marching Home, right? It becomes this anti-war ballad becomes a pro-war anthem in a complete reversal of meaning.
Yeah, the original lyrics are pretty scary too.
Yeah, well, yeah, right? He's like if you're not familiar with it, check it out. It's like every verse is a different bit of Johnny that's been blown off in the war.
He's an eyeless, legless, chickenless egg by the end of the song.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bad song.
Yeah. So
when I think science fiction and war, my brain immediately goes to On the Beach.
Talk about it.
It's, to me, it's not set in any far-flung future. In fact, it's from the past now. But it's the survivors of the nuclear war in Australia waiting for the inevitable fallout. And it's hopeless. It's the original Road. As dark as the Road is, On the Beach is the one that's scary. I remember my mom, when I was a little kid, actually saying that the book scared her. And when I read it when I was in high school, I thought, yeah, I can understand that. If I was a parent, I would be terrified by this book.
Yeah,
especially
well,
at the end,
as cheesy as it was, the made-for-TV movie The Day After, that came out during the height of the Cold War when Ronald Reagan was president, and the tensions with the Soviets had not been higher since the 60s. That had a huge effect on people because they showed the movie and then they had a panel discussion afterwards.
Have any of you read Harlan Ellison's story Soldier?
No.
They turned
I have no mouth, but I must scream.
They turned it into an Outer Limits episode, and it was pretty different, but it was the idea of a soldier from the future who gets transported back to the present, and you learn about what war is done in the future, and there's a vote at the end, and I remember the one scientist saying he was going back to vote a second time because they were because war is that bad. Yeah, it's the short story is probably my favorite Harlan Ellison, right up with Repent Harlequin. So
that shows you though what the power of what writers are doing. What the writers of that period were doing was they were trying to put the brakes on the drive towards nuclear holocaust.
Yeah.
You know, I'm sure Neville Shute wrote that book when he was had turned off the evening news, and it was pretty scary.
Yeah.
It's the sort of thing where you can, that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to say, if this goes on, it could be really, really lousy. Maybe we don't have to go on. And if somebody says that, then people can gather around it and say, we could start an anti-nuclear proliferation movement. And, people come on board if someone runs the flag up the flagpole.
Yeah. But you have to have, in order to imagine an alternative to war, you have to have an alternative to war suggested, right? Like most people, they're just like, oh my God, I can't deal with this. I'm just going to go to work, But if you have a really compelling story, a compelling narrative that gets under people's skin, then you can start to talk about, if not an alternative, at least like, well, this is something to be avoided, right? Like, how much did 1984 do in preventing or at least delaying 1984, right? How much did On the Beach do in preventing nuclear war?
Like the time machine is sort of, you remember the scenario that society had been split into helpless fairy people up above and lower level munchkins never coming up out of the ground below. And that's a reflection of Edwardian society. You have extremely rich people up there having tea on the lawn, and there's a whole bunch of people digging in mines in Wales and never seeing the daylight. And do you really want to do this? It leads to tears, guys. And that's one of the things the book said. And I think people realize, you can't go on this way.
Yeah, well, the Morlocks at least get to literally eat the rich.
And then
that was the only way to really frighten the rich into it. And every now even now you can see it every now and then roll around on the internet, those memes with guillotines. It builds character and it catches the eye.
Another classic in science fiction was Canticle for Leibowitz.
Yes,
had
a great book.
The most depressing commentary on humanity. We blew up the world once. We survived. We'll blow it up again.
Yeah. Let's hit reboot again and grind her all the way back.
Yep.
And worse, they made it even harder. But it's fun, and a lot of the great science fiction writers of the 20th century were veterans of World War II or World War One. And now, we've just come through 20 plus years of continuous war on terror, right? And your daughter,
war on drugs,
war
on everything.
And what books are the veterans of our current wars going to write? Hopefully something better than just more military science fiction.
That the proportion of military to the general population has dropped steadily. Yeah. During World War II, essentially everyone was affiliated to the war effort. Nowadays, I think it's if you just go over the general population, it's 1 in 10. Your odds of actually meeting a veteran of who isn't very elderly now is not that high. There're just not that many of them, unless you live like near Fort Campbell or near the Pentagon.
Yeah, the one of the aspects, like one of the things that science fiction does so well is like, let's explore this or that unintended consequence. And I think one of the unintended consequences of ending the draft, which I think in general was a good thing, is the permanent class of military families that is separate from the Americans who aren't, and the cultures have split. Right, the culture of military families and the culture of non-military families, there's not as much common ground as there used to be. Like in my parents' generation, like all three of my uncles fought in World War II. My dad was in the Army in the Korean War. That was, like you said, pretty universal, right? And I think Vietnam really changed things, right? Because
Right.
it was a shock to the American. I'm not even going to say to the culture. It was a shock to the American story. And we're talking about the power of story.
Right.
And part of the story that America told itself was, we are the good guys and we win all our fights. Right?
You know, it astonishes me that people are still angry at Jane Fonda. You know, of all the people who were
Really?
involved with the Vietnam War, no one can forgive Hanoi Jane about this. It's astonishing. And you know, it's not like, you know, everyone loathed and despised Henry Kissinger, but it's just interesting that an actress is so you know, remember for this after all these years. You are talking what, 40 years, 50 years?
60.
I can comment on that.
Comment.
I can tell you why my mom and dad hated her, and my brother Joe was actually in Vietnam, was wounded multiple times. My brother Rich was on a destroyer that raided Haiphong Harbor, laying mines. And while my brother Joe was over there getting wounded, she was sitting on an anti-aircraft gun in Hanoi posing for pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And that sends a pretty harsh message. You can relate if something similar was to happen while your daughter was in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
It's a poorly thought out anti-war message to go in and do that. That's from their generation. That's Tokyo Rose stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's feeding propaganda against your own children.
Mm-hmm.
So I can understand why some people still feel that way, and I doesn't affect me. She's just an actress. I kind of separate actors from the rest of the world.
So there's actor families.
My mom, that she wasn't just angry; she was betrayed, and my father
That is interesting.
angry. Yeah.
That is interesting. I'm going to write that down. Hang on.
Yay!
Put that in a story and send it to Bob.
Brenda's writing down something I said. All right.
No, I'm writing a book, and so every time you find a little piece of yarn, you write it down and you save it, and then you build up this huge pile of yarn in the middle of the floor, and then hopefully it all coalesces into a long strand, and you can knit a sweater.
Or your neighbors put you away for collecting
writing novels as knitting.
So I've got a couple of comments. One is from Cheryl talking about so Liam says, as it's been said, if you carry a hammer around with you, eventually the whole world looks like a nail. People in the military who prepare for and fight wars eventually start to see the whole world through that lens. That is not a good thing. And Cheryl Alexander comments that that's what's bad about ex-military being in the police force. I'm going to pull out an obscure science fiction book. There's a novelization of the movie Escape from New York. And one of the things it pointed out in the novel that's not in the movie is that the United States police force, which is a national police force, consisted largely of veterans, soldiers, who had been exposed to various chemical weapons in the war against China and the Soviet Union that was taking place in that universe, and had their minds really messed with both through the trauma of combat and as a side effect of these chemical weapons and also drugs they were given as soldiers. And so they were amped up and ready to, like, really aggressive cops, like really bloodthirsty, aggressive cops. And that's a detail that really didn't make it into the movie, but it stuck with me when I read the book, because it was like, wow, that's a really frightening combination, you know. And I could see that channel of veterans into a U.S. And so when Donald Trump started talking about a United States police force, that's what I flashed to instantly, was this science fiction that had said, this is what'll happen if you do that, right? You know, and you know, maybe we won't have a Snake Plissken to take down the system or not. I don't know.
They're actually generals and admirals who actually keep us out of war. I think about the guy, I forget his name now. He was in the news, that Trump wants to try as a traitor if he ever becomes president again.
Yes.
He made sure Trump couldn't start a war to stay in office.
That was very, very important because I'm absolutely certain he would have.
So I think with I kind of understand where if you're a military policeman or a soldier in an occupied country and you come home, you might bring that occupier mentality as a police officer. But I think by and large, most of the men and women who serve in the military are honorable, good people who come home and deserve to be welcomed home, and treasured.
Absolutely.
There is an entire social ritual about the soldier coming home and essentially shedding the war mentality and joining the society again. There's a whole thing. That was one of the great virtues, by the way, of the GI Bill, that they were able to do that with a very large number of soldiers, get them into college, get them to career, get them to join society. Everyone is good. And I will tell you a frightening thing with my daughter is that she came back from Afghanistan with her GI Bill benefits and she went to law school. She is now, she can now shoot you with an M16 and then sue you into bankruptcy. This is terrifying.
Brenda.
The gun in one hand, the law degree in the other hand. I'm picturing it.
It is terrifying, truly terrifying.
Yeah. So, and I think another way that Vietnam broke us, and it broke us because it broke the story of we're the good guys and we always win. It also broke us from the story of we treat our veterans with honor and respect.
Yeah,
because those veterans were not.
The Vietnam veterans didn't get the welcome home.
Right.
From their families.
And from anyone, really. And
families welcome them home. At least our family did with my brother and his friends.
Sure. I mean, it's
the only good thing that came out of the Vietnam War was Joe Haldeman's Forever War.
I don't know, the movies, Platoon and
Full Metal Jacket
were good. But so something Bob
going back to that thing I said earlier, I'm looking forward to seeing what books the War on Terror authors give us. We see movies, but
I've been waiting for that. Every war has its great work of art, and we haven't had our great work of art yet from 9/11, which we're just about at the right time.
We got American Idiot.
One to appear. We haven't had that great
American Idiots. It was the first of all the post 9/11 works of art. The Green Day album, which is.
Mm-hmm. There's a musical, Come From Away, and it is set on that day on 9/11, and that was an excellent musical, and so far that is the best work of art.
I saw a San Francisco Opera performed a 9/11 opera, which focused on first responders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and that was fabulous.
Right. So sooner or later we're going to get something.
You need to talk more. I'm supposed to be the quiet one of the group.
Yeah.
Are we going to talk about why this Bain anthology this is my first appearance in Bain, with Bain, and I had gathered this is a series about the interesting war stories.
Yeah, well, Bain has, of course, they publish a lot of military SF, but they also publish a lot of war-related stories that are not military. So SF, so Bain actually does something really wonderful, which is they give books to U.S. military personnel currently serving. So, like, if you are a member of the military and you write Bain and you're like, I'd like this book, they will just ship it to you. Like
they'll ship boxes to units.
Yeah, they're just amazing.
Deployed and they'll send it.
That is very nice. I'm sorry I didn't know about that when my daughter was in Afghanistan. Although I will say that I sent her a ton of books, and so that's all right. But what interests me is that Bain's that has is mining a tiny little vein here of different kinds of wars to write stories about. And I don't know about you, Martin, but for this one, I got very, very little. There was like no book, no binder full of things that you had to do to fit into the universe of this future war. It was just like war,
Yep.
China, go wild, honey, and that was it. But I don't know if
Now,
they gave you any more
they've
guidance.
actually, as you said, they've had three. They had Weird World War III and Weird World War IV. So you'd have expected the next one is Weird World War V, but instead they went Weird World War China. But
what happened
well,
to the Russians?
there were a lot
Good
of
grief.
Russians in the 3 and 4 books, but for all of them, it has to be speculative and set in the next big war. And then for 4, it has to be speculative after the next big war. And I think they didn't have 5 because after is awfully hard to extrapolate.
Yes.
But they had no more guidance than that.
So how did you approach your story? Martin?
Well, it was a little bit weird because usually they will have some sort of guidance, a timeline.
Yeah.
There was no timeline. They just
Well,
said,
and in fact,
go wild.
When they say weird, they mostly are thinking, this could be fantasy, this could be horror, it can't be a shared world because there's going to be too many differences.
Right. Mine is purely fantasy. I don't know, have not read your story, but my story is purely fantasy, and it is about I'm sure everybody knows that feng shui is that the business in this country. It's the business of arranging your store so that profits flow in through the front door, or building your office building so it's aligned properly. But in Asia, the idea is that these forces are driven by dragons under the earth. And my thought was that if someone drops a bomb on China, somewhere underneath there, a dragon is very, very peeved.
Right. Makes sense to me.
Right?
Martin, how did you approach your story, Martin?
Well, again, I'm not a military person, so I can't necessarily do big battles, but I've written probably nearly half of this fiction I've had published is set in a future history where one of the elements of that history that's never appeared in print before, but I know that there was back in the past of the story, there was a time where the free cities of Luna went to war with a Chinese orbital colony.
Ah, so you told that story.
Well, I tried to, but we had 8,000 words. And I suddenly reached a point in my history where I said, I moved it to early, but late in the history, they discover that everything they thought they knew about that Chinese orbital colony was a propagandistic lie to lead to the war.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
And the person behind the lie, unintentionally, but the person caught up behind the lie becomes a refugee and has to flee to the moon in order to not get assassinated for what he knows. I took that incident and put it at the front of the war, and I told that incident of the day he fled to the moon, and Chinese agents came after him, and lunar border security, who are taking in all these refugees, had to protect his life. So that's not big battles. That is tiny little individual units of 2 to 3 to 5 people fighting each other.
That's a great way to approach the subject of war if you have a novel at length limit, right? This is the same universe as your Blue Collar Space, correct?
Yeah, that is back in the early history of Blue Collar Space, is the lunar cities getting their independence as a side effect of this war with the colony. And so this is Last Dance, Last Campaign, Blue Collar Space. This is that universe earlier than anybody had ever seen before. And it was the only China war that I could come up with.
Well, it seems to have worked because it's in the book. Andrew, you have the story I alluded to, Nair Day, in B-Cube's own Alternative Holidays. Could you talk about the genesis of that poem, which is a story poem, like 3,000 words, something like that?
No.
Okay. Next subject.
I would just told the story of Nair Day is the Scottish holiday of New Year's Day that follows Hogmanay, which is New Year's Eve. And I just had there's a tradition called first footing, which is you want a tall, dark-haired man to be the first person to cross your threshold on after New Year's, after midnight, and because a tall, dark-haired man is not likely to be a tall, redhead Viking. That's the tradition.
That makes total sense. It's a result of war.
They bring certain gifts, and they get certain gifts, and it creates a blessing for the new year.
And what a gig if you're
It
tall
is.
and dark.
My friend's dad was,
you're busy.
everyone wanted him to be the first person to make it across the doorway. My friend Annie. But so I decided to tell the story with a village that was basically dying on an island in the Hebrides. And the young man had to go to war because he had to settle a debt for his father who died. And he goes off and loses his name to war and finds it again in peace and comes home after his stint. And when he left, his little sister was his little sister, and he was a young guy. And she's now in her 90s. And it's her last year, basically. He brings the blessing, but he ends up first footing the entire village with music, and bringing back the color and life to the village at the end. But it's, you just get little allusions to what his war was, like place names. And I think Cliff mentioned to me when he read it, when I first wrote it, that it reminded him of Rutger Hauer's speech at the end of Blade Runner.
Off the shoulder of Orion.
Tannhauser Gate. But it's that little encapsulation of him coming home from the butchery at some place, and he actually lost his name to war. But it was fun to write this poem, and when I write most of my poems, it's free association. So I didn't know I didn't know those are the places he went until they came out while I was writing them. But then it's all there when it's finished. I remember when Alicia Hilton asked me to write a poem, and I submitted it, and I said, I didn't expect it to be this long, and it's close to 5,000 words, and
it just zips by when you read it. It's amazing.
But it was
that is
not as long as my book.
Yeah. We'll talk about that in a future episode.
But book and poetry. But it was I wanted to tell the story of mostly for him coming home for his sister, but in order to tell that story, I had to allude to what he had gone through, and that was a nod to my oldest brother. All of my writing is a nod to my oldest brother when he came home from Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that poem is a beautiful story of the reintegration of the soldier returning home from war. It's just handled very, very well. We're running low on time, so I'm gonna ask one more question. Bob in the private chat pointed out a couple of questions, and one I definitely want to address is the idea of dehumanizing the enemy in war is, of course, a big part of war. We talked about that with the Christmas truce and how it undermined the dehumanizing of the enemy. In science fiction, the war can literally be against non-humans, like in Ender's Game or Starship Troopers or any number of stories like Their Master's War by Mick Farren, which is a fabulous novel, out of print. Everyone should go and find Their Master's War by Mick Farren. Del Rey published it. It was amazing. And Protectorate, which is also sort of the flip side of that universe, by Mick Farren, musician and writer. Anyway, so do you want to talk about, because I know, Martin, in your book, that's a big theme, is the dehumanization of Martians. And if you could talk about that and other people could weigh in on that subject.
Well, it certainly, having alien species makes the humanization much more difficult. It's an unfortunate fact of evolutionary biology that people don't like to notice. Our senses are not designed for reading absolute values. They're designed for reading differences. If you have a green bug on a green leaf, you can tell the two apart, even though they're both green. because it's a difference. So we will see much more distinction there. Our entire cognitive system is built on noticing the different, because the different is what you either eat or run from. And so it's built into us at a very low level. Well, now you take things that don't even look like humans, and we can't help noticing the different. We talked about Enemy Mine, and that was a whole book about, well, novella about having to learn to see past the differences. Dave Farland used to like to teach what he called crucible stories, where the characters are forced to be together by circumstance or location, and therefore cannot avoid their conflict. Enemy Mine is a crucible story where these two deadly combatants are forced into a situation where they're not going to survive without each other. And that becomes a humanizing influence that otherwise would have never been there.
And the other thing is that the dictates of the fiction force us to regard the characters as human. If your alien is completely alien, that's hard to write a story about it, you know. Sentient crystals, it's hard to relate. So automatically, if you're writing the story, you try to make the alien enough, but not so alien that you cannot humanize it so that the reader can connect. So it's a juggling act. But what that means is that within science fiction, all the aliens you ever will see are somewhat relatable. They're not completely alien. A good example would be Star Trek, because all the aliens, because they're played by human actors, have arms and legs and heads. You never get any real tentacle people, because it's too costly to do the effects. Yeah, but this is very rare, because it's really, really expensive. Now, maybe they have really good CGI. They can have real octopoid people, but it was really expensive to do it. And that's why and then they'd have to rebuild the sets, because why would an octopoid person sit in a deck chair? No. So it gets to where we ourselves are creating a expectation that one of these days reality is going to go boom on us, and everyone will say, but they're not like the aliens in Star Wars.
So like,
well, no,
alienness is for generating conflict, but the best stories have restoration at the end, or salvation, or restoration, I think is a good word, because it comes down to, I'm going to quote another poet here, and I think in art and in literature, in music, and most importantly in life, Maya Angelou summed it up. We are more alike than we are unalike. And that's if there's any hope for a story, that's it. And if there's any hope for society getting out of war, that's it.
That is a beautiful way to end the discussion. Before Bob comes on, I'm going to ask people to very briefly plug some book. I'll start so it's less awkward. I have a story in Many Worlds. Anthology came out last year called Battlesuit. And it is about war.
Great story. I love that story.
And it is awards eligible in the short story category. Brenda, you want to plug?
Okay. I'm going to put the link into the chat. I had a short story in Clark's World in July, and of course, if things come out in July, then this is the actual cover of the magazine at that time. But I have the print copy. But I've put the link into the chat, and it's a free click and a free read. And so, of course, now that award season is coming, you've got to run this one up the flagpole again. Did I actually hit send? Let me hit send. Okay.
Cool.
All right, I think that went up.
We've talked about Ula, the Martian Song, Book 1, which is the an interpretation where H.G. Wells was wrong about what he reported. So that would be probably my closest book on this topic. Also, again, we mentioned that there was a weird World War III and IV before China. And I have been honored to have a story in each one, each completely different worlds, completely different approaches. One is a mathematician discovering the secret behind the universe. One is James Bond in space. And then this one in World War China is how the war started with the fugitive on the moon.
Excellent. Andrew.
Okay, I'll throw two up. This is a BQ Press book. Oh, it's backwards. Alternative Holidays. This is where the long poem Nair Days. And then this one's not science fiction, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway.
Please do.
This is Durham and Rose. It's a novel written entirely in verse. There's 61 connected poems about a guy who runs away as a kid to fight in World War I, and then spends the rest of the book trying to find his way back to peace.
Cool. If there's enough interest after this discussion, sometime later in the year, maybe we'll do a follow-up of War and Fantasy, and we can bring up more of Durham and Rose.
that would be fun.
All right. So I'd like to thank my wonderful guests for being particularly wonderful. And we always have great discussions, but this was just a fabulous discussion. And thank you all for coming on and being here. Bob, take it away.
Well, first of all, I'm gonna ask my guests to hang on a little bit afterwards, or your guests, our guests, and say this has been an interesting discussion, because it just how far can you go? You've had an interesting discussion where the subject is so broad that you can barely find a space for Heinlein or.
We never mentioned Heinlein. Good grief.
Oh, I mentioned Starship Troopers a couple times.
Yeah, I did. It made it in. But war, I posted a link to the Gwynne Dyer book on war, because listening to this whole discussion reminds me how we are shaped. I mean, I graduated high school in '76, living my entire earlier parts, seeing my classmates from previous classes get drafted, watching my older cousins go off to war and come back as people we didn't recognize, destroyed by, I think it was Martin that talked about that. The absolute outrage, and also the little things like, remember Orphan Annie, Daddy Warbucks?
Mm-hmm.
I made references to that in the comments, but war wouldn't be what it is if there wasn't so many people whose livelihood depends on having young men and young women die using their tools. It's a war sucks, and whoever quoted the war, what is it good for? In the Alternative War Anthology, that was the text of our open call for it when we sent out and requested stories for that. So now who wrote my short story?
That's me. I wrote that.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah, I wanted to plug Battlesuit for people who are interested in that anthology.
Yeah. Now, and also I would like to point out that we've got Andrew and Cliff both have stories coming up soon in BQ Press in Scott's Planet. Something as soon as I get my button gear, we'll be getting it out. And so thank you all very much. This is an incredible discussion you've had. So any last minute words, Cliff or Brenda or Martin or Andrew?
I'd just like to thank Bob for running this show and handling all the technical issues. I'd like to thank my guests, and I'd like to thank the studio audience for your participation and your wonderful questions and comments. And I'm sorry if we didn't get a chance to discuss every cool comment and question. But.
Okay, well, thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And